A millionaire always helped a homeless girl outside his mansion. When he caught her sneaking in with an old ladder, he waited to confront her about the theft. But as soon as he saw black smoke pouring out of the windows, his heart raced. 2 minutes later, the desperate girl burst through the door, and what she clutches in her trembling arms makes him break down in tears, realizing just how wrong he had been all along. The wrought iron gates hummed softly as they slid aside, revealing the quiet, tree-lined street of the city's most exclusive enclave. Arthur Sterling felt the supple leather of the steering wheel beneath his fingers. The new car scent mingling with the aroma of the gardenias his landscaper so meticulously cultivated. Everything in his life exuded perfection and control, from the impeccably manicured lawn to the precision-timed schedule waiting for him at his downtown office. Everything, except for the small figure sitting on the curb across the street. It was her again. The girl, every day, in the same spot, with the same patience of a stone angel. A part of him, the most cynical and wounded part, whispered warnings of scams and schemes, painful echoes of his ex-wife Helen's betrayal, which had ground his trust into dust. But another part, the one that glanced upstairs to where his 2-year-old son, Leo, slept under the care of the nanny, saw only a child, and that part always won. He pulled the luxury sedan to the curb, the engine purring discreetly. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 7, lifted her face. Her eyes, large and far too serious for her age, met his without a trace of pleading or demand. She didn't hold out her hand, didn't make a gesture. She just waited, with a dignity that disarmed him completely. Arthur lowered the power window. "Good morning, little one," he said, his voice softer than the one he used in boardrooms. He held out his hand, not with cash, but with a small package his cook, at his request, prepared every morning, a cheese sandwich and a juice box. Her small hand, thin and a little grimy, took the package gently. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Her knowing his name had been the first shock months ago, but now it was part of their ritual. He always wondered how she'd found out, but never had the courage to ask. There was an invisible line neither of them dared to cross. He watched for a moment as she carefully unwrapped the sandwich, taking her time, as if savoring the moment even before the first bite. In his world of excess and suspicion, that simple act felt like the most genuine thing he'd seen in weeks. His thoughts turned to Veronica, his new girlfriend. She was beautiful, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in his life, in Leo. But Arthur's cynical voice never fully went silent. Her interest in his business, in his properties, was always a little too intense. He wanted to believe, wanted to give in to a new love. But the ghost of Helen and her manipulation haunted him, making him question every smile, every touch. He sighed, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had to go. An important meeting awaited. "Have a good day," he said to the girl. She just nodded, already focused on her meal. As Arthur accelerated away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl was no longer looking at her food. Her eyes were fixed on the mansion, not with the empty admiration of a tourist, but with a troubling intensity. She wasn't looking at the imposing facade or the lush garden. Her gaze was locked on one specific window on the 2nd floor, the window to Leo's room, and on her face, Arthur didn't see hunger or envy. He saw an expression of deep, inexplicable concern. Arthur's mind was a battlefield. Seated at the head of the immense mahogany table in his conference room on the 30th floor of a mirrored skyscraper, he was supposed to be focused on the profit projection charts his directors were presenting with restrained enthusiasm. Millions were at stake, the result of weeks of arduous negotiations. But his attention drifted, floating out the panoramic window to the streets below, and to the image of that girl, the look on her face, the way her eyes had fixed on Leo's window. It wasn't an empty stare. There was a purpose there, an intensity that deeply unsettled him. He felt a chill, the same cold sensation he'd felt the day he discovered Helen's affair. Mistrust was a slow-acting poison, and he drank it every day. Someone called his name, and he blinked, forcing a professional smile. "Excellent work, Richard. Proceed." But the words sounded hollow, distant. He discreetly pulled out his phone under the table, opening his photo gallery. There was Leo, grinning in his high chair, his face smeared with applesauce. A wave of protective love washed over him, so strong it nearly took his breath away. It was for him. Everything was for him. The lunch break was a relief. Alone in his office, he ignored the gourmet meal his assistant had left on his desk and called Veronica. Her voice was like velvet over the line. "Darling, what a nice surprise. I was just thinking about you." The words were sweet, but Arthur's paranoia passed every syllable. "You too. How's your day?" The conversation flowed through pleasantries, but soon veered into the territory that always made him tense. "I was thinking, Arthur, about our future. That estate up in the mountains. Have you decided what to do with it? It would be such a wonderful place for Leo to grow up." There it was. The subtle but persistent interest. He deflected the question with the skill of a diplomat. "Still weighing the variables, honey. There's a lot to consider." He sensed the slight cooling in her tone, the poorly disguised disappointment. "Of course, darling. Just dreaming out loud." He hung up, the bitter taste of doubt in his mouth. Next, he called home. The nanny, Agnes, answered on the first ring, her voice calm and professional. "Mr. Sterling, good afternoon. Leo is wonderful. He just finished his lunch and is down for his nap now. Everything is under control." Her efficiency should have soothed him, but it only made him more anxious. It was too perfect, almost robotic. Meanwhile, back on the curb across from the mansion, the girl had finished her meal. She tucked the empty wrapper into a small pocket of her worn dress, a habit of someone who had learned not to leave a trace. She didn't leave. She sat again, hugging her knees, and continued to watch. The street was deserted, silent under the midday sun. That's when she saw it. A simple car, an older, faded sedan, pulled up a few yards from the mansion's service entrance. A nondescript man in jeans and a dark t-shirt got out and looked both ways before approaching the side gate. The girl instinctively shrank behind a gardenia bush. Seconds later, the side door opened and the nanny, Agnes, appeared. She glanced quickly down the street before gesturing for the man to enter. He slipped inside and the door closed. There was no exchange of words, just a silent, furtive understanding. The girl's heart began to beat faster. She didn't know what it meant, but her instincts, honed by life on the streets, screamed that something was terribly wrong. That visit was not part of the routine, and the way the nanny had acted, like a thief in her own home, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. Her eyes widened, fixed on the silent house, which suddenly seemed to hold a dangerous secret. Time dragged on under the afternoon heat. The girl, hidden behind the dense foliage, felt her heart hammering against her ribs. It had been nearly an hour since the strange man had entered the mansion, an hour of oppressive silence. She thought about leaving, about forgetting what she'd seen. The street was full of things that weren't her business, and learning to ignore them was one of the first rules of survival. But she couldn't. The image of little Leo, whom she sometimes saw through the window in his father's arms, was etched in her mind. His laugh was like the sound of bells, a sound she rarely heard in her own world. Mr. Sterling was kind to her, and kindness was a rare and precious currency. She felt, with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul, that she needed to repay him somehow, even if it was just by keeping watch. She flinched as the side door opened again. The man came out, glancing around in the same furtive way as before. Agnes stood in the doorway, her face impassive. They didn't speak, just exchanged a nearly imperceptible nod. He walked away quickly, got into his old car, and drove off, disappearing around the bend. Agnes stood for a second, her gaze sweeping the neighborhood, before retreating inside and locking the door. The girl let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding a few miles away, in a chic cafe with velvet chairs and the aroma of imported coffee beans. Veronica ended her call with Arthur, a forced smile on her lips. The moment the line went dead, the smile vanished, replaced by a mask of impatience and contempt. "Variables," she scoffed under her breath, stirring her coffee with a silver spoon. His hesitation was driving her insane. She didn't have time for his trust issues, for the trauma of his failed marriage. She had a plan, a timeline, and he was holding everything up. She picked up her phone again and dialed another number, one not saved in her contacts. The voice on the other end answered without pleasantries. "Yeah, it's me," Veronica said, her voice low and hard. "We have a problem. He's getting suspicious, asking questions. We can't wait any longer. We need to accelerate the timeline." There was a pause on the other end. "That's risky. Not everything is in place." "I don't care," she hissed. "Waiting is the bigger risk. He might start digging, checking Agnes's references, questioning everything. We have to move before he has a chance to think. Understood?" The voice on the other end relented. "Understood." "Good. Be ready." She hung up, fury sparking in her eyes. She glanced at her diamond-encrusted watch. It was time to pay a visit. Back on her vigil, the girl saw a vibrant red sports car pull up in front of the mansion. It was Mr. Sterling's girlfriend's car. She had seen her a few times, always smiling beside him. But now, alone, her face held no smile. It held the same hard, hurried expression as the man who had left not long ago. To the girl's surprise, Veronica didn't go to the main gate. With determined steps, she walked directly to the same side service door. She knocked twice, a coded rap, and Agnes opened it immediately, as if she had been expecting her. The two women exchanged a quick glance, heavy with an urgency the girl could feel even from a distance. They were about to step inside when Veronica paused and looked out at the street, her cold eyes sweeping dangerously close to the girl's hiding spot. Her heart froze. For a second, she thought she'd been discovered, but Veronica didn't see her. She turned to Agnes, her voice low but sharp as broken glass, and the words floated through the quiet afternoon air, reaching the girl's attentive ears with perfect clarity. "There's no more time to hesitate, Agnes. The plan has changed. It's for tonight." The words, "it's for tonight," echoed in the girl's mind like a funeral toll. The warm afternoon air suddenly felt cold, and the skin on her arms prickled. She huddled deeper behind the gardenias, their sweet scent becoming cloying, almost suffocating. Fear, an old acquaintance, wrapped around her like an icy shroud. The first lesson of the street was to look out for yourself, to not get involved in other people's problems. Problems meant danger, and danger was something she spent every day trying to avoid. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to disappear into the web of streets and alleys she called home and never come back. But then, the image of little Leo's smile flashed in her memory, followed by the tired but kind face of Mr. Sterling. He didn't look at her with pity or disgust, like most people. He saw her. He gave her food, but more than that, he gave her a good morning. That small kindness was an anchor in her chaotic world, and the thought of betraying that trust was unbearable. She couldn't just walk away. High up in his empire of glass and steel, Arthur wrapped up the last meeting of the day, his mind still clouded with worry. The feeling that something was out of place refused to leave. It was like a dissonant note in a perfect symphony. On impulse, he picked up his tablet and opened the app for his home security system. He just wanted a glimpse of Leo playing in the living room or sleeping in his crib to soothe his fatherly heart. He tapped the icon for the living room camera. Video signal unavailable. He frowned. He tried the second-floor hallway. The same message. The backyard. Nothing. A knot of anxiety formed in his stomach. He called the house. "Agnes, I'm trying to view the cameras, but they all seem to be offline. Did something happen?" The nanny's voice sounded perfectly calm, perhaps too calm. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, the internet has been terrible today. It's dropped a few times. I had to restart the router twice. That must be it. But don't you worry, everything is in perfect order here. Leo is having his dinner right now." The explanation was plausible, rational, but Arthur's gut, sharpened by past betrayal, screamed that it was a lie. No one was that calm. No one had an answer that ready. He thanked her and hung up, but the anxiety had morphed into a silent, deafening alarm. The cameras offline, Veronica's insistence about his assets, the worried look on that street girl's face. They were disconnected dots, but his intuition was drawing a line between them, sketching a picture he didn't want to see. "Cancel my last appointment, Claudia," he said into the intercom to his assistant. "I'm going home." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed his briefcase, his heart pounding erratically. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt he had to get home. He had to see his son. He had to be sure everything was okay. As Arthur's car cut through city traffic, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In front of the mansion, the shadows grew long, swallowing the girl's hiding spot. The lights inside the house came on, one by one, but the heavy drapes were drawn, turning the house into a sealed box of secrets. Time was running out. She knew she couldn't stay there forever. She had to warn Mr. Sterling. But how? She had no phone, knew no one who could help. She was invisible to the world, desperate. Her eyes scanned the neighborhood for a solution. Anything. And then she saw it, leaning against the wall of the neighboring property, partially hidden by a climbing vine. Was an old painter's ladder, forgotten by some maintenance crew. It was wooden, worn and flimsy, but it was tall enough to reach the second-floor windows. A terrible, dangerous idea began to form in her mind. The decision weighed on her small shoulders as if it were made of lead. Every fiber of her being, trained in the art of self-preservation, screamed against the insane idea. Breaking into a house was the kind of mistake you couldn't take back. A line that he once crossed could change your life forever, and not for the better. She would be a criminal, a thief in the eyes of everyone, including the only man who had ever shown her kindness. The irony was cruel. To protect him, she would have to become the very threat he, with his chronic mistrust, probably already imagined her to be. But the frightened face of Leo, which she could only imagine in peril, overrode all her fears. The fear for the boy was greater than the fear for herself. With her heart thundering in her ears, she waited until the street was completely empty, shrouded in the velvety quiet of twilight. Then, with the silent agility of a stray cat, she darted to the neighboring wall. The ladder was heavier than it looked, and she grunted with the effort of dragging it across the pavement. Every scrape of wood on concrete sounded like a thunderclap to her ears. Finally, she positioned it beneath Leo's bedroom window, the same window she had watched for so many hours. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was tense. Agnes had put Leo to bed earlier than usual, singing a lullaby in a voice that tried to be soothing but trembled slightly on the high notes. Veronica paced the living room, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, everything's ready." "No, there's no turning back now," she whispered urgently. "Just do your part when you get the signal." She hung up and looked at Agnes, who was coming down the stairs with silent steps. "He called," the nanny said, her voice low. "Asked about the cameras." Veronica cursed under her breath, her face twisting into a scowl. "I knew it. He's suspicious. That just proves we have to act now. Did you disable everything?" Agnes nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "The main system, just like you showed me. And the smoke detectors are offline. No one will hear a thing until it's too late." Veronica forced a cold smile. "Excellent. Now go out the back. Remember, you were never here tonight. You left early. Understood?" Agnes nodded again, an obedient automaton, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Alone, Veronica retrieved a small metal can from behind the sofa. The liquid inside smelled like cleaning fluid, but it was something far more volatile. She began her work. Moving with a calculated, terrifying efficiency, Arthur's car devoured the miles. He was driving too fast, ignoring the angry honks from other drivers. With every block closer to home, the sense of urgency intensified, a physical pressure in his chest. He tried calling the house again. This time, it rang and rang, then went to voicemail. Agnes's feigned calm had turned into an absolute, terrifying silence. He floored the accelerator, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios, a kidnapping, a robbery, the image of Helen's face, smiling venomously the day their divorce was finalized, flashed in his mind. Would she be capable of something like this? Of using their own son to get back at him? Paranoia and fear intertwined, creating a monster in his head. He turned onto his street, tires singing on the asphalt, and then he saw it. The sight hit him with the force of a punch to the gut, stealing his breath. Under the orange glow of the streetlights, a small, fragile figure was climbing the painter's ladder, propped against his house, reaching for the window of his son's room. It was the girl he helped, breaking into his house. The sense of betrayal was instantaneous, a bitter taste in his mouth. The kindness he had offered was being thrown back in his face, used as a tool to violate his sanctuary. All his cynicism, all his mistrust, came roaring to the surface, confirmed in the most brutal way possible. She wasn't a stone angel, she was a thief. Rage rose in Arthur's throat, hot and suffocating, obliterating any trace of compassion he had ever felt for the child. It was Helen all over again. A different form, a younger face, but the same knife in the back. He had been played, manipulated by the guise of innocence. His kindness, the one part of himself he still tried to preserve, had been his downfall once more. He slammed on the brakes, hiding the car behind the row of cypress trees that lined his neighbor's property. His instinct screamed at him to run out, to shout, to confront her. But the coldness of a businessman accustomed to corporate ambushes took over. No, he wouldn't scare her off. He would catch her in the act. He would let her get inside, let her think she had succeeded. And then he would confront her with the irrefutable proof of her betrayal. He wanted to see her face when she was caught, wanted to hear the pathetic excuses, wanted her to know that he was no longer the fool everyone thought he was. Hidden in the darkness, he watched, his heart a stone of ice in his chest. He saw the girl struggle with the window pane, pushing it up with an effort that made her small body tremble. And then she disappeared inside. The girl landed on the soft carpet of Leo's room with a muffled thud. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow from the open window. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft sound of the baby's breathing from the crib in the corner. For a moment, she was paralyzed, the weight of what she had done crashing down on her. She was inside Mr. Sterling's house. She was an intruder. Fear made her want to retreat, to jump back out the window and run. But then a strange smell hit her nostrils, a sharp chemical odor that didn't belong in a child's room. It wasn't perfume or cleaning supplies. It was something more sinister, a smell she knew from the alleys, when homeless men would light fires in trash cans with flammable liquids to keep warm. Her heart leaped. She moved through the room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The smell grew stronger near the door. With a trembling hand, she turned the knob and opened it a crack. The hallway was dark, but a flickering light came from the top of the stairs, and the smell was overwhelming here. Downstairs, Veronica was putting the final touches on her diabolical plan. She had soaked the living room rugs and the entrance hall. The liquid formed dark pools on the expensive hardwood floors. She checked her watch. It was almost time. She took a box of matches from her pocket, her hands steady. There was no hesitation in her movements, only a cold, terrifying resolve. She struck the first match. The small flame danced in the darkness, its reflection in her eyes, holding the promise of destruction and wealth. She tossed it onto a pool of the liquid. The flames exploded with a guttural whoosh, climbing the silk curtains with hungry speed. The fire spread, an orange, crackling beast devouring everything in its path. Veronica smiled, a terrible, triumphant smile, and ran for the back door, the escape route Agnes had prepared. The plan was perfect: an accidental fire, a nanny who left early, and she, the devoted girlfriend, would arrive soon after to comfort the devastated man, to help him rebuild, cementing her place beside him and his fortune. She hadn't counted on a witness. Hidden behind his car, Arthur continued his bitter vigil. Minutes passed, feeling like an eternity. What was she doing in there? Stuffing her pockets with Veronica's jewelry, stealing his cash. The anger began to give way to a cold impatience. He was about to emerge from his hiding place when the smell hit him, an acrid, unmistakable smell of smoke. His gaze shot to the house, and his blood ran cold. Thin wisps of black smoke were beginning to escape from the seams of the downstairs windows. In seconds, the wisps became a thick, dark cloud. The smell of burning intensified. Mixed with the odor of melting plastic, panic, pure and primal, seized him, obliterating everything else. Fire. There was a fire in his house. And his son, Leo. Leo was upstairs, sleeping on the second floor, right where the fire seemed to be concentrating. Arthur's world disintegrated in an instant. The thought of betrayal, the cold rage, the need to be proven right. It was all incinerated by the overwhelming terror that took its place. Leo, the only thing that mattered, the only person in the entire universe that was purely his, was in there, in a trap of smoke and flames. A guttural sound, a roar of pure panic, tore from his throat. He was no longer the millionaire CEO, the man of control and power. He was just a father, and his child was in mortal danger. He launched himself from his hiding spot, his legs moving before his mind could fully process the catastrophe. The smell of burning was now a thick stench that scratched at his lungs. The flames, once invisible, began to lick at the living room drapes, turning the window into a hungry orange mouth. He ran toward the front door, his hand fumbling in his pocket for keys that weren't there, left in the car's ignition. The door was locked. He threw himself against the solid wood, once, twice, his shoulder screaming with sharp pain, but the door wouldn't budge. Despair swallowed him. He looked around wildly, searching for a rock, a tool, anything to break a window. Every second was an agony. He could hear the crackle of wood, the shattering of glass somewhere inside. His imagination, his worst enemy at that moment, painted horrific images of his son, alone in his crib, the smoke filling the room. Guilt crushed him. He should have been there. He had trusted a nanny, been distracted by a girlfriend, wasted time hiding in the shadows to catch a supposed thief while the real danger closed in on his son. Tears of rage and fear blurred his vision. He was about to run to the side of the house to try the ladder the girl had used when the front door burst outward. It wasn't unlocked. It was kicked open by an impact from within. In the doorway, framed by smoke and darkness, a small silhouette appeared. For a surreal moment, time seemed to stop, and then the figure staggered out into the streetlight, and Arthur's heart stopped beating. It was the girl. Her face was covered in soot, her eyes wide with terror, her hair singed. But that wasn't what paralyzed him. It was what she was carrying in her thin arms, clutched to her chest with desperate strength. It was Leo, his son. He was coughing, his small face red and scared. But he was alive. He was breathing. The girl took a few more staggering steps onto the lawn and collapsed to her knees, exhausted, but never loosening her protective grip on the boy. In that instant, Arthur's universe reconfigured itself. The anger, the suspicion, the betrayal, it all dissolved into a tidal wave of shame and gratitude so intense it buckled his knees. He wasn't looking at a thief. He was looking at a hero, a small, soot-stained angel who had risked everything to do what he, the father, could not: save his son. The tears that had been born of fear now flowed freely, hot and uncontrollable. They were the tears of a broken man who had just been handed back the only thing that kept him whole. He ran to them, the sound of his own sobs filling the night air. He scooped Leo into his arms, hugging him with a force that made him whimper, but he couldn't take his eyes off the girl, who now looked up at him, gasping for air, before her eyes rolled back and she fainted on the grass at his feet. Sirens tore through the silence of the night, their red and blue lights painting the facade of the burning mansion in ghostly flashes. Paramedics, firefighters, and police officers swarmed the property, a chaotic ballet of urgency and professionalism. Arthur barely registered their arrival. He was sitting in the back of an ambulance, the scratchy emergency blanket over his shoulders, holding Leo so tightly his arms ached. The boy, after being checked over and declared unharmed aside from mild smoke inhalation, had finally calmed down and fallen asleep in his lap, his small face still smudged with soot, his tiny fingers clutching Arthur's shirt. Every one of Leo's soft breaths was a symphony to Arthur, a sound he swore he would never again take for granted. His gaze, however, was fixed on the other ambulance, where the girl was being treated. She had regained consciousness, but remained lying down, small and frail amidst the medical equipment. An oxygen mask covered her face. He felt a debt so profound, so immeasurable, that the word "thank you" felt like an insult, a paltry coin offered for a priceless treasure. A tired-faced police officer approached him, holding a notepad. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Detective Miller. We need to ask you a few questions." Arthur nodded, his mind still numb. He recounted the night's events in a flat, almost robotic voice. The suspicion about the nanny, the offline cameras, the decision to come home. When he got to the part where he saw the girl climbing the ladder, his voice broke. The shame burned inside him, hotter than the flames that still consumed a part of his house. I thought she was breaking in to steal something," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I hid. I waited to catch her in the act." The detective gave him a look that was a mixture of pity and professionalism, and then the fire started. "Yes," Arthur whispered, "and she came out with my son." At that moment, the girl, whom the paramedics were calling Jane Doe, for lack of a name, sat up on the gurney. She pulled off the oxygen mask, her huge eyes searching for something. When they found Arthur and Leo, an expression of pure, genuine relief softened her features. The detective moved over to her, his tone deliberately gentle. "Hello, young lady. You were very brave tonight. Can you tell us what happened in there?" The girl swallowed hard, her throat raw from the smoke. Her voice came out as a hoarse wisp of a sound. "The nanny," she said, the words a struggle. "I saw her, earlier, with a man, and then the pretty lady, his girlfriend. She came." Arthur stood up, his heart giving a painful lurch. Veronica. He hadn't even thought of her. Where was she? He fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking, and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. "What did you see, honey?" the detective asked, leaning in to hear her better. "They talked," the girl continued, each word an effort. "The pretty lady said, 'It's for tonight.'" The phrase hit Arthur like a lightning strike. The plan accelerating the timeline. Just as Veronica had mentioned on the phone, it wasn't about business. It was about this. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place in his mind, forming a picture so monstrous he could barely breathe. Suddenly, the noise of the hoses and the shouts of the firefighters seemed to fade away. The only thing he could hear was the faint voice of this child, exposing a truth his paranoia had never dared to imagine. The nanny, Veronica, they were in it together. It wasn't an accident. It was attempted murder, and the target wasn't just him, it was his son. The revelation fell over the chaotic scene like a silent bomb. Detective Miller looked from Arthur to the girl, his expression of professional fatigue replaced by a sharp alertness. He'd handled plenty of arson cases, many with tragic stories, but the direct accusation from the lips of a child, a witness who had just become a hero, changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. His girlfriend, the detective repeated, his voice low and serious, making sure only he and Arthur could hear. "Are you sure that's what you heard, honey?" The girl nodded, her large eyes steady, without a hint of doubt. Life on the street had taught her to watch, to listen, to memorize details others would dismiss as irrelevant. Every word, every gesture was a piece of information that could mean the difference between safety and danger. Arthur felt the ground vanish beneath him. Veronica, the woman he was just beginning to open his wounded heart to, the woman he'd imagined might help piece his broken family back together. The image of her smiling at Leo, tickling him until he giggled, now seemed like a scene from a horror film. Every memory was tainted, every sweet word now sounded like poison. He had been blind, not by love, but by a desperate need to believe that goodness still existed. And ironically, true goodness was standing right in front of him in the form of the child he had scorned. He walked over to the girl, Leo still asleep on his shoulder. He knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She hesitated for a second, as if her name was a long-kept secret. "Lena," she whispered. "My name is Lena." "Lena," Arthur repeated, the name sounding like a prayer. "You saved my son. You saved everything that matters to me. I can never thank you enough." The tears returned to his eyes, but this time they were of a gratitude so profound it felt like it was breaking something open inside him. Lena just watched him, her small face serious. To her, it hadn't been an act of heroism. It had been a necessity, an instinctive response to protect an innocence she herself had lost long ago. She glanced at little Leo, and for the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. "He has your smile," she said softly. The simplicity of the observation, the purity of that moment amidst the chaos, disarmed Arthur completely. Meanwhile, the investigation began to move quickly. Detective Miller sent a squad car to Veronica's address. Another team was assigned to dig up any information on the nanny, Agnes. The firefighters, now getting the blaze under control, began the forensic work, searching for the fire's origin. One of them approached the detective, holding an evidence bag. Inside were the melted remains of a metal can. "Found this in the living room, detective. Smells like an accelerant, definitely arson." The physical confirmation of what Lena had said sent another chill down Arthur's spine. He looked at his house, the blackened structure, now an empty shell of what had been his home. It was just bricks and mortar. He had almost lost his true home, which was sleeping peacefully in his arms. The police returned from Veronica's apartment with frustrating news. She wasn't there. The doorman said he'd seen her leave with a suitcase hours earlier, saying she was going on a surprise trip. Agnes's apartment was also empty, cleaned out. It was as if she'd never existed. They had vanished, leaving a trail of destruction and unanswered questions behind them. Arthur felt a surge of helpless rage. They couldn't just disappear. They had to pay for what they did. But how to find them? The authorities had their procedures, but Arthur knew they were slow. He had resources, contacts, an empire built on the ability to find information others couldn't. He looked at the detective. "I'll find them," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a steely resolve. And then he turned to Lena, who was watching him with a wisdom that didn't belong to her age. "And you, Lena, you're not spending another night on the street. You're coming with me." The transition from the street to luxury was jarring for Lena. Arthur took her and Leo to one of his penthouse apartments he kept in the city, a sanctuary of glass and marble floating above the neon lights. The uniformed doorman eyed her with suspicion, her grimy clothes and disheveled appearance a smudge of raw reality in the immaculate lobby. but Arthur's icy glare silenced any objection. Upstairs, the apartment was larger than any space Lena had ever inhabited. The walls were windows that showed the entire city, a glittering carpet of lights. She walked across the plush rug as if treading on clouds, touching the cool surface of a glass table with her fingertips in wonder. Arthur watched her, his heart aching. He called one of his trusted staff, a middle-aged woman named Clara, to bring clothes, food, and anything else that was needed. Clara, with her motherly aura and gentle smile, asked no questions. She simply drew a warm bath for Lena, found a soft pair of pajamas that, though large, were comfortable, and made a thick, hot chocolate that smelled like heaven. While Lena was in Clara's care, Arthur locked himself in the study. The initial rage had cooled into a methodical, cold resolve. He was no longer just the victim, he was a hunter. He activated his network, spending a fortune on private investigators, cybersecurity experts, and informants. He wanted to know everything about Veronica and Agnes, their pasts, their connections, their financial transactions. The police would do their job, but he would do his, faster and with fewer rules. The first pieces of information began to arrive before dawn. Agnes was a ghost. The name was fake, the documents forged. The employment agency that had recommended her, one Veronica had found for him, was a shell company that had vanished from the internet. Veronica, however, was different. Her past was real, but it was riddled with gaps. There were stories of previous relationships with wealthy men that ended abruptly and under mysterious circumstances, always with her coming out in a better financial position. She was a predator, and he had been her latest, most ambitious prey. The most alarming discovery came from his financial analyst. Veronica had been making large wire transfers to overseas accounts for weeks, quietly draining a joint account they had opened. She had been preparing to run. After her bath, Lena looked like a different person, her face clean and her hair washed. Her delicate features were revealed. She sat on an enormous sofa, clutching the mug of hot chocolate with both hands, looking even smaller in the vastness of the room. When Arthur emerged from the study, his eyes red with fatigue and fury, he found her watching Leo, who was asleep in a portable crib Clara had set up. "He's safe now," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. Lena nodded, but her eyes were filled with a worry that went beyond tonight. "She, the pretty lady, she's not coming back, is she?" she asked, the vulnerability in her voice striking him to the core. "Not if I can help it," Arthur answered fiercely. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Lena, the police will want to talk to you again. They'll need you to tell them everything you saw and heard. It might be scary, but it's very important." She looked down at her hands. "No one ever believes me," she said, an echo of countless rejections and dismissals. "I believe you," Arthur said, and he had never meant anything more in his entire life. "Your word is the most important thing in the world right now." The morning brought a new wave of trouble. An official from social services, a stern-faced woman named Miss Diaz, arrived at the apartment. The fire had raised a red flag, and Arthur's ability to provide a safe environment for Leo was now being questioned. The idea that they could take Leo from him, even temporarily, was a devastating blow, a hurdle he hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Sterling, given the circumstances, an act of arson, a missing nanny, we have to ensure the child's well-being," Miss Diaz said, her tone formal and impersonal. Arthur argued, explained, but the rules were clear. An investigation would be opened. And to complicate matters further, the presence of Lena, a street kid with no records or known relatives living there, raised even more red flags. Suddenly, the hero who had saved his son was seen by the bureaucracy as another complication, an irregularity in an already complex case. Arthur felt the walls closing in. He was fighting a war on two fronts, hunting the monsters who had tried to destroy his family, while desperately trying to stop a well-meaning but blind system from finishing the job. The presence of Mrs. Diaz in the apartment was like a cold cloud hanging over the fragile sanctuary Arthur was trying to build. Every question she asked, while professional, felt like a veiled accusation. She observed his interactions with Leo, noted the condition of the impeccable apartment, and asked pointed questions about Lena, whose eyes followed the woman with a deep, silent mistrust. For Lena, authority figures like Ms. Diaz represented an existential threat. They were the people who could send her to a shelter, a place that, for many street kids, was just a prison with stricter rules and different dangers. And the girl, Mr. Sterling, what is her legal status? Ms. Diaz asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Arthur felt a surge of protective fury. Her status is that she's a hero who saved my son's life, and she is under my protection, he answered, his voice sharper than he intended. That is not a legal answer, sir, she countered calmly. Until her identity is verified and her family situation is clarified, she is an unaccompanied minor, and her presence here in the midst of a criminal investigation and a custody evaluation is irregular. The weight of those words crushed Arthur. He was trying to do the right thing, to protect the two children who now depended on him, but the world seemed to be conspiring to punish his kindness. He was at risk of losing Leo to the system and seeing Lena torn away and thrown back into that same system. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a maze of rules and regulations that had no room for courage, sacrifice, or humanity. While Arthur battled with Mrs. Diaz, his investigators worked tirelessly. One of them called, his voice excited. "Mr. Sterling, we found something. Veronica wasn't working alone. She has an accomplice, a guy named Ricardo Vargas. He has a history of petty fraud and seems to be her go-to muscle. And guess what? His description matches the man the girl saw visiting the nanny." The name Ricardo lit a fuse in Arthur's mind. Richard Vargas had been an executive in one of his companies, fired for embezzlement over a year ago. Veronica had met him at a company event before her relationship with Arthur had even begun. The pieces were connecting. She hadn't chosen him at random. She had been studying him, planning, recruiting people from his past who held a grudge against him. Arthur's fight for custody of Leo intensified. The insurance company, citing the criminal nature of the fire, began creating obstacles for the release of funds, leaving him in a temporary financial limbo that, while not personally affecting him, complicated his image as a stable provider in the eyes of social services. He felt besieged, attacked from all sides. In the midst of this turmoil, his connection with Lena deepened. She was quiet, observant, but in the silent moments, she offered a kind of comfort no one else could. One night, finding her awake and looking out at the city lights, he sat beside her. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Too many different noises," she said. "I'm used to the street being quiet at night." He understood. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of sounds he couldn't hear. "Lena," he began, his voice hesitant, "about what you heard, the conversation between Veronica and the nanny. Do you remember anything else? Any detail, no matter how small?" He hated to press her, but he felt time was running out. Lena closed her eyes, her small face concentrated. Life on the street had gifted her an almost photographic memory for sounds and images. It was a survival mechanism. She began to speak, her voice low, almost a murmur, replaying fragments of the conversations she had overheard. And then she said something that made the blood in Arthur's veins run cold. The pretty lady was on the phone later, with the man. She said, "Don't worry about the boy, the life insurance takes care of that part. The important thing is securing the inheritance before he changes the will." Lena's words hung in the rarefied air of the penthouse, laced with a poison so pure Arthur struggled to breathe. Life insurance, inheritance, will. This wasn't just about a fire to force a marriage or collect on the home insurance policy. the plan was far more monstrous, far more final. Veronica hadn't just wanted his money, she wanted everything. And to get it, both he and his son were obstacles to be removed. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him and leaving him dizzy. He looked over at the crib where Leo slept. His son's innocence, a brutal contrast to the evil that had targeted him. The attempted murder wasn't an act of desperation or impulsive greed. It was a cold calculation, a business decision made by a psychopath. The depth of the betrayal was unfathomable. He had opened his home, his life, and most importantly, his son, to a monster hiding behind a pretty face and sweet words. Guilt ate at him, a sharp, searing pain. How could he have been so blind? "Arthur!" Lena's soft voice pulled him back. She was watching him with a concern that belied her age, her large eyes reflecting the anguish on his face. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted forever. She wasn't just the child he had rescued from the street. She was his anchor, his witness, the keeper of the truth that could save what was left of his family. He pulled himself together, the pain crystallizing into a steely resolve. There was no more room for self-pity. It was time to act. He picked up the phone and called Detective Miller, his voice firm, without a tremor. "Detective, I need you to get over here now. We have something new, something critical." 2 hours later, the apartment was a makeshift war room. Detective Miller, accompanied by a child advocacy specialist from social services to ensure Lena wasn't unduly pressured, listened intently. Lena, sitting on the sofa next to Arthur, told her story again, this time with the horrifying new details. She repeated the exact words she'd heard, her eidetic memory proving to be a formidable weapon. She described the accomplice's car, the exact timing of the visits, the tone of Veronica's voice. Every detail was gold for the investigation. Based on Lena's testimony, the police secured a warrant to track the cell phone activity of Veronica and her accomplice, Richard, Arthur's own cybersecurity expert. Working in parallel, had already made progress, finding a digital trail leading to a small town near the border. They hadn't left the country yet. They were waiting for the heat to die down, likely to collect a final payment from some offshore account. The net was closing. The tension in the apartment was palpable. Arthur paced, phone glued to his ear, coordinating his investigators with the police in an unusual but effective partnership. Miss Diaz from Social Services, who was present for the testimony, watched everything with a new perspective. She saw the undeniable bond between Arthur and Lena, the way he protected and trusted her. She saw the desperate love of a father fighting tooth and nail for his son. The stern-faced bureaucrat was beginning to see the family that was being forged in crisis. The decisive call came in the middle of the night. It was Detective Miller. "We got them, Sterling," he said, his voice tired but triumphant. They were in a cheap motel 20 miles from the border. Richard Vargas sang like a canary, said Veronica was the mastermind, that she manipulated him with promises of a cut of the inheritance. They never expected the kid to make it out to tell the story. Immense relief, so heavy it nearly buckled his knees, washed over Arthur. It was over. They were caught. Leo was safe. But the relief was quickly followed by a wave of raw emotion. He looked over at Lena, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted, the little guardian angel who had appeared on his curb. Without her, he'd be dead or grieving, and Veronica would be free and rich. Justice had been served, but the emotional battle was far from over. He walked over to Lena, adjusted the blanket over her, and for the first time in many years felt a genuine peace begin to settle in his heart. The storm had passed. Now, it was time to rebuild. The following weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, depositions, and the slow reconstruction of a shattered life. Richard Vargas's confession opened the floodgates, revealing the full extent of Veronica's conspiracy, the wire transfers, the altered insurance policies, The hiring of the ghost nanny, it all came to light, painting a picture of cold, calculated premeditation that shocked even seasoned prosecutors. Veronica, faced with the overwhelming evidence and her accomplice's testimony, maintained a defiant, arrogant facade, but the cracks in her mask of superiority were plain to see. The news of their arrest ripped through high society like a wildfire, becoming the scandal of the year. For Arthur, however, there was no feeling of victory or vengeance, only a somber relief and the need to move on. Justice was taking its course, and his focus was now entirely on his new, fragile family. The social services case against him crumbled. Detective Miller's testimony, praising Lena's bravery and Arthur's devotion, combined with the obvious stability and love he showed for Leo, led Mr. Diaz to recommend closing the investigation. On her final visit, the stern-faced woman showed a rare glimpse of warmth. "You have a wonderful son, Mr. Sterling," she said, watching Leo play on the floor, "and an incredibly brave daughter." The word daughter hung in the air, weighted with a significance that made Arthur's heart quicken. He looked at Lena, who was sitting on the floor, helping Leo stack blocks. She had fit into their lives with a surprising naturalness, like a piece of a puzzle they hadn't known was missing. The idea of adopting her, which had started as a fleeting thought of gratitude, had blossomed into a profound, undeniable need. She was no longer just the girl he helped. She was family. The adoption process was complex. Lena had no birth certificate, no records. To the state, she simply didn't exist. Arthur leveraged his resources to hire the best legal team, who dove into a bureaucratic labyrinth to give Lena an official identity. During this time, he learned more about her. She told him, in fragments, about a mother who had disappeared when she was very young, about living with other groups of street kids, about learning to read from scraps of old newspapers. Each story was a small cut to Arthur's heart, reinforcing his determination to give her the security and love she had been denied. The mansion, partially destroyed, was put on the back burner. Arthur decided he didn't want to go back there. The place was stained with memories of betrayal and terror. He bought a new house in a different neighborhood, one filled with light and a large yard, a place to build new memories, not to be haunted by old ones. The emotional climax didn't happen in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but on a sunny afternoon in the garden of the new house. The final adoption papers had come through. Lena was officially his daughter. Arthur called her over to talk. His heart pounding with a mixture of joy and nervousness, he knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "Lena," he began, his voice thick, "I know I can't replace the family you lost, but I would love it, if you'd let me. To be your dad, me, you, and Leo, a real family." He had expected an answer, maybe a shy smile or a nod, but Lena simply threw herself into his arms, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck, and for the first time since he'd met her, she cried. These weren't the silent tears of fear or exhaustion. They were deep, cathartic sobs, the release of years of pain, loneliness, and uncertainty. Arthur held her back, his own tears dampening her hair, feeling the healing of his own wounds in her embrace. In that moment, all the mistrust, all the scars from Helen's betrayal, finally began to fade, replaced by the unconditional love for his two children. Justice had been served, but the true resolution was found there, on the grass, under the sun, where a broken family was finally made whole. 4 weeks had passed since the terrifying night that nearly destroyed everything. Autumn had arrived, painting the leaves in the new home's garden with hues of gold and crimson. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of a new beginning. Arthur sat on a wooden bench, watching his children play on the lawn. Leo, now steadier on his feet, toddled awkwardly after a ball, his giggles echoing through the yard. Lena, with a patience that seemed infinite, followed him, making sure he didn't fall, her face lit by a genuine, relaxed smile that Arthur had never seen before. She was no longer the girl with the haunted, serious eyes from the curb. She was just a kid, finally free to be one. The sight filled Arthur's heart with a peace so profound it was almost a physical ache. He had lost a house, a fortune in material assets, and the illusion of love, but in return, he had gained the entire world. The news that Veronica and Richard had been sentenced to long prison terms barely registered a ripple in his new universe. That chapter of his life was closed, filed away in a mental drawer of painful but necessary lessons. The betrayal that had almost destroyed him had ultimately taught him how to discern the true character of people, not by their sweet words or polished exteriors, but by their quiet acts of courage and kindness. He learned that trust was not something to be given lightly, but neither was it something to be withheld out of fear. It was a risk, yes, but a risk worth taking for the right people, and he had found the right people. The transformation in Arthur was profound. The extreme distrust that had governed him for so long had been replaced by a conscious vulnerability. He was still a shrewd businessman, but his heart, once locked away, was now open. He had found a new purpose, a mission that went beyond accumulating wealth. The week before, he had finalized the charter for his new foundation. The Guardian Angel Foundation, as he named it in Lena's honor, was established with a clear goal: to provide shelter, education, and support for homeless children. He would use his fortune and influence not to build more monuments to his own wealth, but to build futures for those the world had turned its back on. He wanted to ensure that no other child had to develop an eidetic memory or superhuman courage just to survive. He wanted them to just be kids. Lena came over and sat beside him on the bench, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He's tired," she said, watching Leo yawn. "We both are," Arthur replied, putting his arm around her. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, one filled with everything that didn't need to be said. The past had been a storm of fire and fear, but they had emerged from the ashes, not unscathed, but stronger, forged together by the flames. The journey had been one of suffering, but the resolution wasn't found in the punishment of the guilty or the recovery of assets. It was here, in this simple moment of peace. It was in the certainty that love and loyalty could spring from the most unexpected places. The poor girl he had nearly condemned had not only saved his son's life, but had also saved his soul, teaching him the true meaning of family, selflessness, and human connection. She showed him that sometimes, to find the light, you must first walk through the darkness. Arthur looked up at the sky, at the clouds drifting lazily by. He knew there would be other challenges, other sorrows, for that was life. But now, he was no longer alone. He had his children. He had a purpose. He had a home, and that was more than any fortune could ever buy.